What is the least restrictive environment, or LRE?
The least restrictive environment, or LRE, is the school environment that gives a special education child the most exposure to non-disabled children. This means that children with disabilities are educated with children who are not disabled to the maximum extent appropriate. Children cannot be removed from the regular classroom unless they cannot learn there, or they are so disruptive that the other children cannot learn. Before the IEP team decides to remove the child from the regular classroom, the team must consider whether the problems the child is experiencing can be addressed with additional aids and services in the regular classroom. In other words, school districts should try supporting a child in the regular classroom before moving him to a more restrictive environment. Another way to look at the question of least restrictive environment is to ask, can the child make reasonable progress in the regular classroom with appropriate support? If the answer is yes, then the child should be placed in the regular classroom all day with support provided there. If the answer is no, then the IEP team needs to determine how much time the child needs to spend outside the regular classroom in the special education classroom, sometimes called a resource room, or with a service provider, such as a speech-language therapist, to be able to make reasonable progress. The goal is to remove the child for as little time as possible from the regular classroom, but to assure that the child is in the setting necessary for the child to make educational progress. Sometimes the term least restrictive environment is confused with the term mainstreaming. A child is mainstreamed when he is in all regular or general education classes and is not pulled out for any special education services. For many students, a mainstream setting is the least restrictive environment. The student can get all the special education support he needs in a regular classroom. For other students, though, the least restrictive environment might be in a separate classroom or school. It all depends on what setting allows the child to make reasonable progress.
What does it mean for my child to be categorized as regular, resource, or separate on his IEP?
These are terms used as shorthand for the decision about how much time your child will be in various settings during the school day. In particular, they reflect how much time your child will spend outside of a regular classroom. Being in a regular setting means that your child spends most of the day, 80% or more, in a classroom with non-disabled peers. Being in a resource setting means that your child spends between 40 and 79% of her day in a regular classroom, with the rest of her time spent in a special education classroom. Being in a separate setting means that your child spends less than 40% of her day in a regular classroom. Children can also be placed in separate day schools, public or private, in residential schools, at home, or in the hospital. This range of settings is sometimes called the continuum of placements. It is important to recognize the difference between placement and location. A placement refers to the type of special education setting in which a child spends his day. It is determined by how much time the child is with non-disabled children. A child's placement does not necessarily change when the child is assigned to a different school, so long as the amount of time spent with non-disabled children remains the same as the previous school.
Is the resource classroom available only to students who are below grade level?
No. A resource classroom usually refers to a classroom in which a special education teacher is the main teacher, but that teacher teaches different groups of students during a school day. Students are pulled out of their regular classrooms to go to the resource classroom for special education in a particular subject. Resource classrooms are often smaller, and the teacher can provide more targeted instruction to meet the unique needs of the students. If a child who is at grade level needs a smaller or more structured class due to a disability, such as autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or emotional disability, then the child should be placed in such a classroom. The question is always whether the child can make reasonable progress in a regular classroom with supplementary supports. If the answer is no, then the team must consider other placements. If the child is working at grade level in the general curriculum, then that curriculum should be offered in a classroom setting that will allow the child to make progress. Whether it is called a resource classroom or has another name, it should be a setting that is appropriate for the student.
What What is homebound and when can my child be placed there?
Homebound and home hospital are terms used to express the most restrictive of special education settings. If a child cannot function at all in a school building, regardless of the level of support provided, then the child may need to be placed in this most restrictive setting. If the child is hospitalized for an extended period of time, his IEP should be changed to reflect that the educational program must be provided at the hospital. Some hospitals have hospital schools, and the hospital staff works with this home school to work out an appropriate educational program. If a child is medically fragile and is too weak or sick to attend school, a homebound placement is often appropriate. A placement at the child's home means that the child does not attend school in a school building, but is provided an appropriate educational program at home or in another location outside of school. This should only be used in the most extreme circumstances when there are no appropriate alternatives within any school setting. Before the IEP team considers homebound placement, the team must consider other options such as specialized private schools or residential schools. Typically, when a child is placed on homebound, a special education teacher provides educational services in the child's home. These services must include actual instruction, not just worksheets. In other words, the homebound teacher must teach, not just bring work from the regular education teacher to the child. The amount of education must be enough for the child to make progress on his or her IEP goals and to continue to learn what is being taught in the regular classroom. The team will decide on the number of hours per week the child needs. Homebound services should usually be in place for a limited amount of time and should be reviewed by someone on the child's IEP team at least once a month to make sure that the placement is still appropriate. Homebound services are not appropriate when the child has special needs that cannot be met by the local school district. In such a case, the IEP team is required to look outside the school district for appropriate services. Sometimes the district will need to hire special staff or contract with special schools or services to meet a child's needs. It is not appropriate for the school district to place a child in a homebound setting because the child has behavior problems. If a parent disagrees with the homebound placement or believes that the student is not getting an appropriate education through the homebound services, the parent has a right to use the dispute resolution mechanisms available. These are described in more detail in the IDEA dispute resolution chapter of this guide.
Can a homebound setting be used when my child is suspended from school?
Sometimes. The homebound placement may be used temporarily when the special education student has been suspended from school and there is no alternative school available. The law requires that even while suspended, the special education student must have a teacher so he can make progress on the IEP goals and learn regular classroom lessons. Also, the student should receive behavioral education designed to help the child avoid misbehaving in the future. Before the IEP team can assign a child to a homebound placement during the period of suspension, it must determine that such a placement is the, quote, least restrictive alternative available. Thus, all school-based options such as alternative schools must be considered. Further, if the team determines that being at home is the least restrictive alternative, a designated member of the team must review the child's placement at least monthly to determine whether a less restrictive placement is available.
If my child is put in a homebound setting, how many hours of instruction should he get?
The law does not specify a number of hours for a homebound setting. This is up to the IEP team. However, a child must receive enough hours of instruction to allow him to keep up with his regular classwork and to continue progressing on his IEP goals. If the child cannot make reasonable progress on his IEP goals with the amount of homebound hours the school offers, or keep up with the regular classroom work, then he may be entitled to more homebound hours. However, if the homebound child needs only a limited amount of direct instruction per week to make reasonable progress on his goals and stay with his class, then a lower number of homebound hours might be appropriate. It may be appropriate for some children in a homebound setting to get some instruction online.
Is it legal for the principal or the IEP team to say my child has to come home early every day?
This would almost never be lawful. A shortened day takes away school time and can hurt your child's progress. The reduction of the school day to less than a full day is sometimes called a, quote, modified day. This could be appropriate for a temporary period if a child is too sick to attend school for a full day. The IEP team must determine how the child will continue to receive all the special education services identified on the IEP and will continue to have access to the lessons in the regular classroom. Neither a, quote, modified day nor a homebound placement is appropriate as a response to a child's behavior problems. A child with a disability who has difficulty following school rules requires special education to address the behavioral issues. Reducing the number of hours at school because it reduces the child's opportunity to misbehave is not consistent with providing the child a free, appropriate education, does not help the child learn to behave more appropriately, and discriminates against children with behavior problems by limiting their education. Rather than sending the child home from school, the IEP team should consider other options for responding to the misbehavior.
If my child's school does not have an appropriate placement for my child, can I ask to have him move to another school in the district with an appropriate placement?
Yes. If your child's current school does not have an appropriate placement or the services your child needs, then the school district should transfer your child to a school that does have an appropriate setting or services. If appropriate services are not available anywhere in your public school district, then the IEP team must look at private school options for the child at school district expense. The school district must provide transportation to whatever setting the team selects.